Hi there. This is James Valvis, and this is going to be a Poepinion. Yes, I did that. I titled it a Poepinion. My wife is groaning in the other room, and she's currently asleep because she knows my love of the terrible pun. And this is about as bad a pun as a person can make. Poepinion. What I really wanted to do was just take my ugly mug off the table and not have people focusing on that rather than what I'm trying to say. And so I'm going to use Mr. Poe's avatar as a replacement for my rather hefty visage. I hope he doesn't mind. And, I often feel like I'm so grateful to writers like Mr. Poe, who has been such a joy to me. And I think, he died when he was like 40 years old, somewhere in that area. So that means I'm almost 10 years older than him. And I think of his great literary accomplishment. And I just feel very humbled by that. So it's a great honor to me, even just to be able to put his face up there, pretend to be him for a little while. Anyway, my topic here is not my bad puns or my love of Poe, but patriotism. And since I'm starting this on Independence Day, 2018, I thought that I would say something about what I think patriotism is and why I think it's important to have and not a bad thing to have. I don't subscribe to the whole leftist jingoistic nonsense that has been gaining such traction in the culture for over the course of my lifetime. It's picked up speed, and it's going to continue to pick up speed, I believe, regardless of what anybody does or says. When these things start to go bad, history shows us over and over again, when a society begins to go bad, it doesn't reverse itself. It just continues to go bad. You can slow it down some. You can, arrest the descent to some degree, but generally speaking, a society that has started free fall will not suddenly grow wings and start flying again. But I'll do what I can to make us glide a little bit. That's what I'm doing here. Excuse me while I crack a soda. But the patriotism. What does patriotism mean? It means love of country, and I don't subscribe to the idea that love means just anything yet the hell you want it to mean. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that you can stomp on the flag and take a crap on it and wipe your butt on it and you're still patriotic. You're just patriotic in a different way. No, you're not patriotic. You're just not. Stop it. Stop lying. You're not patriotic. You're not anything close to patriotic. You hate the country. Just admit it. At least be honest in what you believe. Don't be offended by the fact that somebody says you're not patriotic when you're not patriotic. If you don't love the country, and what I mean by love the country, I mean love the country as it is today, not as it's going to be 100 years from now, not as you want it to progress toward. Notice I've used the word progress towards in some future time where everything will be utopia and everything will be perfect. That's not love of country. That's love of using the country to get to where you want the country to be, and often is you don't want the country to be at all. You want the country to be disbanded in a lot of ways, to become something other than America and what America always was, and the foundational principles of America. Because America has changed in a lot of ways, but I don't think its foundational principles have really been in jeopardy until recently. Not even the Civil War was a threat to its foundational principles. It was a threat to its union. It was a threat to its overall survival as a political entity. But it was not a threat to its basic fundamental values. Not even if the South won was it that, because there are still many of the basic principles that we consider distinctly American and having to do with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that would have still been preserved. But what we're looking at now, what we're seeing now, is a real threat to the basic foundational principles of America. and what it means. Those Enlightenment values are the founders, that is found primarily in the Bill of Rights, as the Bill of Rights was written, not as the Bill of Rights has been expanded, but as the Bill of Rights was written. And to include certain amendments like the 14th and the 15th Amendment and things of that sort, and the amendments that gave blacks the right to vote and equal due process and those kinds of things, women the right to vote. So these values are now under threat. If you look at the New York Times, just ran an article yesterday saying that free speech is a threat to equality in America. That free speech is somehow benefits the rich and the patriarchy, and should therefore be limited as much as possible, because it's a tool of the oppressor over the oppressed. That is a direct assault on American values. America is not America without free speech. It is a foundational principle. It can't be usurped. It can't be undone without utterly changing and destroying and blowing up America. It's simply not possible to have that freedom taken from us and for America to survive. Let's talk a little bit about love and what love means. We're talking about love of country. Love. When I talk about love, I say I love my wife. You say you love your wife. You say you love your daughter. You say you love your uncle. You say you love your cat. You say you love anything. It doesn't matter what it is in the world. You love it. Does that mean that person or thing or animal or plant or whatever it is, that car, is a perfect being or thing? That it has no flaws? That it has no history in which that thing or person has to be ashamed, or has to be, can look back and say, well, that was not the best thing to do? And of course not. I look at my wife. I know that she's made mistakes. I know that she continues to make mistakes. Not many, thank God. But when I say I love her, what do I mean? I love her. Do I love her only if she becomes perfect? Only if she always does what I want her to do? Does that mean or take my daughter? My daughter is not a fully developed person yet. Even though she's 18, she's much more developed than she was, say, 10 years ago. But she's not fully developed. She's still developing as a person, and will continue to develop all through her life. It'll decrease as she gets older. She has less to be developed. But everybody is developing, and the country is developing. The country is, not the same country exactly as it was in 1865, but that's not to say that you should not have loved your country in 1865, should not love the country today. The country is its foundation, the way it is, the very essence of the country is its essence. And that essence is either loved or it isn't. When I say I love my wife, I don't say, well, I love that you didn't do the dishes today. No, I understand that she should have done the dishes. She said she would do the dishes, and now she hasn't done the dishes. I'm not just making this up. My wife always does the dishes when she says she's gonna. But the idea that somehow something has to be perfect in order for you to love it, in order for you to have pride in it, in order for you to defend it, is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's not any kind of standard that you would put on anything else. You would never say, oh, you say you love your wife, you're jingoistic. You don't do that. Nobody ever says that. Oh, you love your wife too much. Nobody ever says that. And yet they say it all the time about your country. They say you're not supposed to, oh, why do you love your country so much? There's lots of countries in the world. Well, yeah, there are lots of countries in the world. And I'm sure that, the citizens of France love France. They love its history and its art and its culture, and good reason. And France is I'm a Francophile. I hate to admit it because they annoy me all the time. But their culture and their history is tremendous. I love France. I've always wanted to go to France and visit France. I've still not gotten to Paris. I've actually visited France one time, and I went to the Cathedral of Strasbourg, and I've written a poem about that. And it was a beautiful country. It's beautiful, and the people are very interesting and nice, and then the culture is, long-standing, and you just it's taken some dark turns in the last 100 years, and I really don't appreciate some of it. The whole Jean-Paul Sartre and that line of thinking, the real dark man bites dog film that comes out of France and stuff. Anyway, it's appropriate to talk about France because they were our first allies and and helped us in the fight for independence. It's wrong to call it the American Revolution. It was not a revolution. We didn't overthrow the English monarchy and install our own monarchy or our own government there. We just fought for independence. So it's not a revolution. In France there was a revolution, but in America, in Russia there was a revolution, but in America it was not an American Revolution. It was a war for independence, and thankfully we won it. The way I'm seeing things go in England, I'm really thankful that we won it. Anyway, love. When you say you love someone, you say you love something, you understand that there are flaws, and America has flaws. America had slavery, but again, remember, America didn't have slavery very long. Most of American history, was American colony. Where there was slavery was during the American colonies. It's wrong to call them American slaves. They're not American slaves. They're British slaves. Those were British colonies. They were run by the British government. And yes, they had some small degree of independence here, but for the most part, those were British slaves. They were not American slaves. They weren't American slaves until America was its own independent nation. And in that time, it became like, 1781 or whatever, when they decided, they were going to keep slaves and, at least to salvage some kind of union, because the South would have just said, to hell with you, we're not going to get rid of our slaves. And the country would have never formed into a union if the founders had tried to eliminate slavery right away. But it couldn't stand up, the slavery could not stand up to its founding principles very long. I mean, within a very short period of time, America fought a war to get rid of them, because that kind of cognitive dissonance where you go around saying all men should be equal, all men should be free, and then you have you're there beating on whole groups of people in which you're completely limiting their freedom and their right to profit from their own labor, and then the horrendous abuse and all kinds of rape and everything else that was going on to this. It's not a situation. It's not a thing that can stand. Those two things can't stand side by side very long, and they didn't stand side by side for a century, which is a short period of time in the span of history. Now England, somewhat to their credit, got rid of slavery before we did, but you have to remember, they didn't have a whole lot of slaves at that point. They'd already lost their American colonies that had slaves, so it was not a big. It's sort of like, I talk about cost me nothing liberalism. Like, progressives are always writing checks with somebody else's money, and to some degree, Britain was doing that. Britain said, "Well, yeah, we can get rid of slavery. We don't have a lot of them," and America, though, did have a lot of them. It was costly to America to get rid of slavery, and yet they did. They did. Ultimately, yeah, it took a war, and a pretty heinous war at that, but we did. We did it because, not just because to save the Union and all that, but because it was wrong. Lots of people understood that. Lots of people did that, and it's amazing that our country took that step. We basically ended slavery in the world forever, at least up till now. I mean, there's still some slavery going on in the world, sex slavery, that kind of thing, and it's a blight on humanity. It will always be a blight on humanity because it's a human failing. It's not an American failing; it's a human failing. It's across all people. It's like if my wife lies, is it just specific to a character? Yes, in a way, but it is also just human condition. People lie. That's what they do. And people own slaves. That's what they do, and they still do, because we have a fallen nature. We've always had that fallen nature. It's not going to change. When after America fought that war, that pretty much ended slavery in the West, certainly in the West. It's just some greater degree it lasted in the East, but even there, it has struggled to survive. It is always under threat, slavery, and it has no fans among good people anywhere anymore. Nowhere. There's nowhere you can go where you can say slavery is a good institution, instituted by God Himself or something. You can't do it. It won't work. Nobody will buy it. And that's thanks to America. Does America ever get credit for that? Nah, America doesn't get credit for anything it does. It saved the world during World War I. It saved the world during World War II. It saved the world from the communist threat that killed 100 million people in the 20th century. They just piled bodies on top of bodies everywhere across the world. And the only place that stood against that, the only place that could have stood against it, was the United States. I mean, England stood against it to some degree, and some degree, the West, West Germany and that sort of thing, and they were the front line. So one has to respect Europe to some degree, but for the most part, it was American power and American will that saved the world from these horrendous regimes that killed millions and millions of people, and would have killed millions and millions of more, except that they were afraid of the United States. That's all that saved the world from this tragedy. What would have been ultimately the death of any kind of decent government. And so, you look back and you see a My Lai, or you see a Kent State. You see these times where America failed, where America had not very good moments. You look at a Jim Crow, where even though slavery was beaten back, bigotry was not. And you look at certain things of that sort, and you say you can get a laundry list of these things and just run around the internet all the time talking about how horrible a place America was, and look what it did to the Native Americans, and look what they did to, and it's just the easiest thing in the world to do, is find fault in anything or anyone. Anyone can do it. It's not hard, because you don't have to know a whole lot. You don't have to think a whole lot. You can just find a few things and then paint yourself as this moral paragon. But you're not really. Not really are you a moral paragon, looking at the world and pointing a finger at the United States. All it shows is that you don't know history very well. And you don't know history of the world. You don't know the history of America, and you don't understand or can't put into context these things that exonerate America in just about every way. One could look at and just find any kind of country in the world and say, look at their history and say, you're horrible. You're absolutely horrendous. Look at France, and you talk about how they behaved in Northern Africa. Or look at England and their colonial history and how they sometimes treated those people. Or you look at someone like Japan and how they treated China when they conquered them in World War II, or what they did in Pearl Harbor, for instance. Or you look at China, and you talk about the Great Leap Forward and what happened there with literally tens of millions of people either starved or slaughtered for their political beliefs. Look at Cambodia, where they piled skulls upon skulls, 2 million strong, 2 million. The country's not that big. There's like maybe 6 or 7, 8 million people in the country, and they killed 2 million of them. You're talking about like a quarter or a third of the population or whatever. They killed them all just because that's what they needed to do to have socialist utopia. And you go across the world, and you look at Saudi Arabia, and they're just chopping people's heads off because they've been accused, not even found guilty, but accused of being prostitutes or apostasy, converting into Christianity, and they're getting stoned in the street in in some Muslim countries. and you can go on throughout all of history. You talk about slavery in the United States. Well, one of the reasons why the United States has a large black population, and a large mulatto population is because, relatively speaking now, there's nothing good about slavery. I'm not defending slavery. But relatively speaking, our slaves were treated better than the slaves that went east. The slaves that went east into Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Muslim countries, they were treated so horrendously that there is no significant black population in the Muslim countries. They were just slaughtered. They were just used and ridden until they died, they died out. If you were a slave in what is present day Liberia or something, and you were either going to go east or west, you were either going to come to America, or you were going to go to Egypt. If you had those two things, you better pray that you came to America. As bad as it was here, that was a way. It was not going to just be better eventually for your ancestors, because the famous Muhammad Ali quote, when he was asked, he went to Africa and he came back and they asked him, "What'd you think of Africa?" And he said, "Thank God my great granddaddy got on that boat," something like that. What he meant is that things are so bad over there that it's just better to be a black person in America than anywhere else. And it's true. Black people in America make more money than black people anywhere else in the world. So in all those African countries and everywhere else in the world, you're just better off being an African American than anything else. So yeah, but you were better off coming to America as a slave than you were going to the East, because you were probably going to die. You almost certainly were going to die if you went through Egypt and into the Muslim countries, because they were just barbaric in how they treated their slaves. And so every country in the world has flaws. Every country in the world can look back at a time and say, these people did not behave badly, well. I mean, look at the Roman Empire. My own people, the Greeks, they were, the Romans came in and they just took us from our homeland, and they stole our women, and they took us into Italy, and they made us into servants. Sometimes we were tutors for their children. They took a great, you talk about cultural appropriation, which I think is a joke, but they basically stole all the whole entire Greek culture. I mean, all the Roman gods are just Greek gods with different names. So they just latched onto that whole thing. But it's, my best friend from high school is Italian. What are you going to do? Hold that grudge forever? You're going to sit there and say, those damn Italians, I hate them. Or those damn Turks. The Greeks and the Turks are always fighting. Those Turks, I'm just never going to, I just won't like anybody forever who's a Turk. It's just silly. So ultimately, you look back at America's past and you say, yeah, there are things that happen there that are not optimal in any way. And, and certainly we should going forward, we should do our best to overcome and not engage in those things again. But when I look at America and I look at our founding principles and I look at the great lives that America has produced and the great wealth it's produced and the great happiness it's produced for so many people from its system and from its genius, how can you not love it? How can you not love it? It's like I said, it'd be like me looking at my wife and all the happiness that she's brought me and saying, well, yeah, but you got that varicose vein, so to hell with you, I'm going to go find me a young secretary over there. And it turns out the young secretary isn't nearly as pretty as you think. Because you want to see how pretty she is, go down to Venezuela and see how pretty your utopia is. It's not pretty down there. It's not pretty. Your idea of a perfect world and America, you are far better off here than your idea of a perfect world, because your perfect world isn't nearly as perfect as you imagine it to be. The best world is a world where most people are free. They're free financially as much as possible. They're free politically. They're free. They have free speech. They're free to practice religion and worship God in the way they choose or not choose. They're free to associate with who they want to associate with. So that you're not forcing, Christian bakers to bake for gays, but you're also not forcing, African American bakers to bake for the KKK or Jews to bake for neo-Nazis. So you should be able to associate with who you want. So, when I talk about a love of country, I'm not talking about some far future, far-flung America, but this America here. And the closer that we get to its foundational principles, the stuff that's in the Constitution, the stuff that we base the country on, and that's led to ultimately transforming the world into an era, an epoch of great peace and prosperity and general happiness. Yeah, this is a wonderful country, and you should be proud to be an American. You should be happy. You should be thankful. That's the most important thing. You should be grateful every day that you're an American. Millions upon millions upon millions, billions. Hell, just about everybody else in the world would love to be an American. That's why they come here. That's why they scale the walls. That's why they float on little rafts to come here across the dangerous shark-infested waters. That's why they wait in long lines to just to have a chance to come here. It's a wonderful country, and it's filled with wonderful people. Most people, even most progressives, are wonderful people. And so, on this Independence Day, you should treasure that the United States of America exists, that flag still flies overhead. You should thank your military, especially those people who protect it every day at the risk of everything personally to them and their families. And so, this is my first one, and I hope it was a good one. And God bless you, and God bless America.